So now for the last presentation that I want to share with you, I want us to think about relevant drivers for the future. And you will have given some of your thoughts into the last forum. And now I want to plug in some of the themes that I see. As with the last video, these are themes that I personally identify as I think likely to be prominent for the future. So just have a see if any of these interact and overlap with the suggestions that you were making. If I'm suggesting things that you haven't thought about, you might want to consider these as we go through the module. So the first thing that comes to mind, I talked a little bit about population growth in the past. Now, I originally presented this slide back in 2017, but I think the same logic applies. So in 2017, we had a global population of about 7.6 billion. At the time, the projection for 2030 was that it would be 8.5 billion, which is an addition of around 900 million extra people at the global level. Now, numbers are difficult to think about, but if I were to say to you that's the equivalent of the 2017 total population of Honduras, maybe that gives you some kind of qualitative idea that we're talking about an awful lot of people. And that is by 2030, when we are hoping, when the plan is to have delivered on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But what if we think now further into the future? What if we think to 2050, probably about the time that we're going to need, when you guys will have written a new set of goals for completion by 2050. So here we're talking about 9.7 billion global population, which is an extra 2.1 billion people added over the population of 2017. Now, to help you think about that, that means adding the combined population of, as it was in 2017, of China, the United States, Indonesia, and also Brazil. That is how many additional people will be added over that period. Thinking finally to the distant future, but a time frame that it certainly gets used in terms of planning for global sustainable development, 2100, we're talking a total of 11.2 billion, an extra 3.6 billion people. And this is on a relatively best case scenario, average case scenario in terms of reduction in the global population growth, the red line going through the center there. I have no idea what the country equivalent of that is. But this is the future, or this is a driver of the future food system that we will need to construct if we are to satisfy the latent, likely probable growth of the human global population. If we're failing to meet that aspiration, incidences of hunger, undernutrition are only going to be exacerbated. If we think forward to around 2050, as we've thought about in the past, it's really important to consider the geography. So where are these new people going to be added? Well, it probably comes as no surprise that the largest population growth moving forward, so we talked before up to, I think it was from 1980 to 2015, looking forward from 2015 to 2050, the vast majority of population growth will come in Africa and the sub-Saharan African region. There will, however, be population growth in North and South America, according to the United Nations projections. Although there are some parts of the world where the population will start to decline. And of course, this has important implications for the challenges that we face in terms of delivering a global food system that's fit for purpose. But we can, of course, ask a more micro geographical question, I suppose, and to think about, well, within countries, where are the places where people are going to most likely live? So just have a little think, where is it in your mind that the food demand is going to be greatest within an individual country? Now, here we can start to think about population in rural and urban environments. Now, as you can see from the graph over time, from 1950 through to 2050, and population in millions, the urban population has historically been lower than the rural population, and this is at the global level. However, in about 2007, we believe that this relationship changed and the urban environment became dominant. And it's partly for this reason the other module I'm teaching this term is on sustainable cities, because cities become a really important location. But subsequent questions evolve. So we might know it's the urban space that will have the majority of future population growth. But what types of urban space might be most important? And also, what geographical regions are these urban spaces going to be located in? Have a little think. Maybe you have some background knowledge. But from what I understand from the statistical projections, while there's often a big focus on the idea of megacities, big dense concentrations of people in cities, actually it's small to medium cities that are going to predicted to absorb quite a significant amount of human population growth. And it's also in the Asian countries where urbanization is considered to potentially going to happen at a faster rate. So when we're thinking about the future drivers of the food system, we obviously need to think about these geographical factors. There's no point in investing in food production where it will not be accessible to the sort of geographically different population centers. If we're thinking about food security and we're thinking about access to food, I would say we obviously need to think about financial and economic inequalities within countries. So you may have a country that has sufficient amounts of appropriate and safe food and all that, but if there are large parts of the population who can't financially access that food or at the right level, then this is also a brake on achieving food security. Probably no surprise that thinking about changes in inequality, it's North America, it's the UK, it's large parts of Europe where inequality has been and is predicted to be in the future to grow the most. This is a reality of the geography of food access that we need to think about. Oh, I can't believe we've got this far without mentioning the climate change concept. We know that climate change is a thing, that it's happening. If we start to think about the future, so this is from the IPCC in 2014. So here we have the IPCC's worst case scenario, which is the RCP 8.5 scenario. And we have the RCP 2.6, which is the best case scenario because we're getting no more new emissions and no more new emissions. So we're just dealing with the emissions in the system. And we know, obviously, that depending on what we predict in terms of temperature change, there are going to be other implications for the biophysical environment in which we're trying to produce food. So here again, drawing from the IPCC, there is a projection that there will be changes both, as we obviously know, in surface temperature, but also in precipitation. So if you look over to the left-hand side, the two globes top and bottom, you will see this is changes for the RCP 260 scenario, and on the right-hand side, the worst case scenario. Now, in the worst case scenario, which is a scenario that's not likely, but it's likely in the sense that there's a 3% chance of it happening. And as I think you might have heard me say before, if you're going to put bullets in a gun and play Russian roulette and spin the chamber around and ask me to point it at my head and pull the trigger, I would prefer a 0% chance that there's a bullet in that gun, not a 3% chance. But nevertheless, we can see that in the worst case scenario, we're talking about average temperature changes up to 11 degrees centigrade. Even in the best case scenario, we're talking about temperature changes generally in the region of 1 up to about 3 degrees, and in some places, particularly around the North Pole, 4 degrees. Now, knowing what we know about the sensitivity of ecosystems, this, even in the best case scenario, this is going to have an impact on food production. Absolutely likewise with precipitation. In the worst case scenario, we've got up to a 50% increase in precipitation, not just over the sea, over the Pacific Ocean, but also over land areas. Now, of course, this is temperature change and precipitation change is a complex is a complex driver. It's not to say that all places in the world will find it harder to produce food. Some will find it easier and will have higher yields, others will not. So we need to understand understand these issues in a detailed, nuanced, from a nuanced perspective. Now we know that the other thing attributable to climate change is very likely an increase in the frequency of extreme weather events and also their severity. Now we don't need to look at the future. We know we can see the impact of extreme weather events now. And it's not to say, as always, that these are caused by climate change, but what we are fairly certain of, the IPCC thinks, is that events like these are more likely and will potentially be more extreme if the climate changes in the way that we think. Now, we also know that where the weather changes, we can see food shortages. And this is a case study, not a very good one, from 2018. You probably weren't in the UK necessarily then, but we had a shortage of lettuce, and there was a shortage of salad, and this was all over the newspapers because climate patterns weather had not behaved in the way that was predicted, and therefore there was a crop shortage. The UK eating lettuce leaves is not a particularly large welfare problem, but obviously you can see how this extended to other crops in particularly other parts of the world is going to be a problem for human welfare and the propriety and the needs of the food system that we need to create. Looking forward more generally, as I said, it's a very complicated process to try to make predictions about what will happen to crop production yields. Now here we have a recent effort from a centre that specialises in food security, and we can see, to take wheat as an example from the top left-hand side, large parts of the world are green. So this is a prediction that there won't be a food production gap, and therefore there's going to be a low impact of climate change. However, if we start to look at other parts of the world that are blue, actually we can see that there'll be no production gap. There won't be too much demand for the supply, because actually climate change is going to produce a positive outcome. So greater crop yields, more food available per head of population. However, unfortunately, we also see that there is a red square at the top, where this is a prediction of a high food production gap. So where the gap between supply and demand is significant, and this is a result of high impacts of climate change. And of course, so not so much around wheat, where Africa has some yellow spots, but thinking about maize and thinking about one of the more primary staple products of the African region, we can see a lot more countries likely to be experiencing a high food gap, and certainly more countries experiencing some negative impact. As a qualitative summary, the organisation published this on their website. So it's the negative impact is going to be geographically focused and geographically spread. But we know this. This isn't a surprise to us. But what we do need to do is to deal with the detail of this when we're thinking about possible interventions and responses. We've got to cover the sea, of course, because large parts of our food supply comes from water and from the sea. And this is particularly true of certain parts of the world. Now, broadly speaking, analysis suggests that the sustainability of fish stocks are suffering over time. So looking here from 1975 through to 2015, the amount of the global waters that are categorized as overfished are increasing. The amount of new available areas of the ocean, so at the bottom of the graph, the underfished, is dramatically depleting. So we're increasingly pushing ourselves towards a future where our traditional use of the ocean as a food supply is becoming more and more unsustainable. Now, when we start to factor in climate change, which is what these graphs here indicate, we start to see an even greater chance that sea harvesting will be. Sorry, it's really hot in my house and it's really late because doing all these videos takes ages. Right, I'm going to try and compose myself. These graphs show us that in the darker lines, which are the worse, the more difficult climate change scenarios, and the scenarios in which global fishing fleets are unadjusted, we are seeing a drop in the fish take in various important categories, such as shellfish, pelagic fish. The graph on the right indicates that while in some of the better case scenarios, a drop is smaller, in the worst case scenarios, they're significant. So this is related to climate change, it's related to ocean acidification, and it's also related to other degrading factors such as the loss of coral reefs, etc. So all these things, as we know from environmental principles, are interrelated. As if the natural world wasn't presenting enough problems, we've got geopolitical stresses. So you're probably aware that there has been a movement of late. More powerful, more wealthy countries and interests within those are buying up land in the developing world and less wealthy countries in order to produce food for the core economic countries. Now, quite often, this has the implication that local people are forcibly sometimes evicted from their land. It gets sold out from under them. So while one part of the world, and generally our part of the world, is securing its food for the future, there are communities in these parts of the world who are actively losing the very foundations of their food production. They can't grow food if they don't have land, and therefore they're forced into buying food in markets, which may make them, well, very likely makes them much more food insecure because they have less financial resource to access buying food from other people. So this is a big geopolitical driver. I mentioned before incidences of conflict. This is also creating stresses for food production. So we might have micro conflict. So the picture on the left-hand side, physical competition over, for example, fishing waters. In other cases, as I made reference to before, the outbreak of civil war obviously compromises both food production, but also the logistics. And in some cases, the response to conflict can be geopolitical in the construction of trade blockades, etc. So it's an intentionally human constructed undermining of food security. And from what we can see, it looks like the future will hold more of these conflicts, not less. Now, very finally, I wanted to update my presentation for this year to talk about the COVID-19 public health crisis. There's been a lot of work done on this by other scholars and experts. It's something that I'm working on starting to assimilate into my own knowledge. But as you can see from the graphic here, there is already a fairly well conceptual understanding of how the global pandemic might be influencing global food chains. What I want to pull out is just a few things. We've been constantly told or exposed to the discourse, the narrative around the public health crisis that we're all in this together. We're all in the same boat. So I'm sorry your life is hard, but it's hard for everyone, and we all just have to make do. However, like pretty much most crisis situations and most of the other contexts, when people try and use this metaphor, I think if we think about it critically, it's very unlikely actually that we're all in the same boat. Some of us are in way better boats than others, and our individual responses, if we are all falling out of the boat, are going to be very, very different. I particularly like, as an extension of the visual metaphor, this idea of us all being in the same boat. We have global elites who are economically privileged, stores of wealth, stores of capacity, engaging in a process of absolute denial about the realities of the global crisis in terms of the COVID-19 and also in terms of the implications for food and our future of food, because they are probably going to be okay and they don't need to worry. And therefore we have these very pernicious narratives that blames the victims of these situations. So here, the social elite is saying, well, it's your fault, you need to row, which actually reminds me of when the government say to us, well, it's your fault that the R value has gone up because lots of people did things they shouldn't. We told you not to go to the beach. And I think this is clearly an attempt to abjure themselves of the responsibility that they should be bearing and gives you an insight into the nature of our world. Now, I haven't had a lot of time to look into this, but I have tried to do a bit of work, and I think the things I found were quite interesting. So a couple of documents, which is on the list of references from the OECD, talking about, you can see here, food supply chains and COVID-19 and the impacts. And we can look at the titles here. So number one actually says that this is placing unprecedented stress on food supply chains. But it's okay, because the developed world, we're largely okay. We've got the capacity and the resilience to deal with it. So that's fine. And actually, don't worry, there are some bottlenecks, a few little niggling problems here and there that may require our attention, but essentially this is okay. I feel like this is probably untrue, because I think the risks in our food system are much greater than the OECD is aware of or is admitting to. I think we, as privileged members of the global north, are much more likely to see an impact from some of the problems of food insecurity than the social elites here would like us to think. And of course, this being the OECD entirely ignores what's happening in the developing countries and less economically developed parts of the world. So much so, and in a way this is unfair, but I think it's indicative. Looking through this report, figure 1, now if you were looking through a report about the impact of COVID on food supply, and you knew there were figures and graphs, what might be the first figure that you would expect to find? I'm not really sure what your answer would be, but I certainly wouldn't expect figure 1 to be restaurant reservations and a story about how their collapse has created a problem for OECD countries. I think the very fact that this report picks this out as a detail, now, not to say it's not important, because restaurants are food supply and they are livelihoods, so I don't want to take anything away from it in that regard. But the idea that this is a thing to focus in on, I think gives us a sense of the level of privilege, both in the experience of these countries under COVID-19, but also the framing of analysis and the way that knowledge about this is created. I think we've got way bigger problems than what's being focused on here. But I'll leave you to dig into that critically in your own time. This now brings me to the very end of my audiovisual presentations for the whole week. So if you've got this far, thank you very much for your attention and for your interest. And I just want to finish by saying what I've wanted to do is paint an indicative sketch of some of the drivers, current and future, and some of the current outcomes of the food system. I hope you've learned a few new details, and I hope some of those have drawn your interest, because straight away I want you to start thinking, well, if I'm looking to produce my assessment about a particular food system, what would I like to do? But what I want to say is that as we move forward, looking week to week, I'm going to be trying to focus on the response possibilities. So when we talk about food production, we are going to talk about some of the technological opportunities to create more sustainable forms of production. We'll look at supply chain, supply and distribution, and we'll think about how we might organize and manage a supply chain in a positive, practical way to improve food systems. And we'll look at things like consumption and how we might look at local policies and regulations, all sorts of things. But I just want to say at this point, as long as we have some idea of the overview of the issues that we might be dealing with, we can now move forward to thinking about some of the interventions that might be required in the future.